Carter Milton was only 13 when he solved an Ivy League final exam, without touching a pen. But instead of praise, Harvard professors quietly removed him from the classroom. No reason, no warning. The next day, his mother walked into the office, and they handed her a withdrawal form like it was routine. No one expected what happened next. Because the boy they erased, he made sure the whole world would watch. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Some professors were intrigued. A few were visibly skeptical, but most exchanged quick glances, their expressions flickering with something unspoken. It wasn't just surprise, it was discomfort, the kind that arises when someone defies the silent rules of where they're supposed to belong. On the third day, the tension snapped into something sharper. It happened during an unannounced problem-solving round. A spontaneous challenge set by Professor Adrian Wolfe, the gatekeeper of the unsolvable proof segment. A towering man with a booming voice and a PhD from Princeton, Wolfe prided himself on being the intellect no student could outpace. He scrawled a nonlinear differential equation across the whiteboard so dense it looked like it belonged in a graduate thesis. "Anyone?" he asked, arms folded, smirking as the class went quiet. 2 hands went up. Neither offered anything coherent. Carter remained still, his fingers tapping the edge of his desk. Professor Wolfe's smirk deepened. "Then we'll move." "I have it," Carter said softly. Heads turned. Wolfe blinked, then stepped aside with exaggerated flourish. "By all means." Carter rose slowly, walked to the board and stared at the equation for a few seconds. He didn't touch the marker. Instead, he began speaking. First, he rewrote the terms in his head. Then he broke them down, explaining the chain rule, recognizing the patterns, isolating the variables. His voice was unhurried, but precise. Within 3 minutes, he had deconstructed the equation verbally and reached the solution, with no notes, no calculator, no hesitation. The room was silent. Professor Wolfe didn't clap. He didn't smile. He nodded curtly and turned away, lips pressed into a line. Moments later, he packed his notes and left the room. That afternoon, Carter's name became a whispered fixation. "No one does that in their head," another scoffed. "It's impossible." By the end of the week, some professors had stopped calling on him altogether. Carter noticed. He noticed the sudden silences when he entered a room. The way discussions moved faster when he raised his hand, quickly redirected or dismissed. He noticed how his assigned study group was restructured, leaving him with no partners. And he noticed how during office hours, some professors leaned on vague advice instead of guidance. It was during a Friday session, right before the scheduled final assessment, that the room reached its breaking point. Carter was seated in the front row once again, while Professor Wolfe paced in front of the chalkboard. "Today's review," he said, "is optional. But if you want to pass, I suggest you try the sample problems." He handed out a thick packet of questions and returned to the board, writing a new one. Carter stared at the board. His mind moved faster than his hand. Integrals, substitutions, limits, they all rearranged themselves into clarity. Without a word, he rose from his seat, walked to the board, and gently erased the equation. The room gasped. A few students chuckled nervously. But Carter wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He rewrote the problem, corrected a silent mistake the professor had made, and began simplifying it. No notes. No paper. Just his mind and the marker. Behind him, Professor Wolfe's jaw tightened. In the back of the room, Dr. Lynn Herschel, a senior faculty advisor, watched with narrowed eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't applaud. Instead, she quietly reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her phone, and stepped into the hallway. As the door shut behind her, Carter stood at the board, unaware. He had just solved a problem intended to humble an entire class. And someone had just made the call that would change everything. One professor quietly picks up the phone and walks out as Carter erases a calculus problem without using paper. The hallway outside the lecture room smelled faintly of varnish and old wood. Lynn Herschel's heels echoed as she walked, her expression unreadable, her phone pressed tightly against her ear. On the other end, a clipped voice responded. Low, calm, administrative. No names were mentioned, just a few phrases. "We may need to consider classroom integrity." "Yes, it's drawing attention." "No, not quite the right fit." She hung up and stood by a tall, arched window, overlooking the Harvard yard. Students walked below, laughing, passing books between them, framed by centuries of elite tradition. But Herschel's gaze didn't follow them. It remained fixed, sharp, calculating. Back inside the classroom, Carter had returned to his seat, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. The problem on the board still glowed in faint white dust behind him. His correction left untouched. Professor Wolf avoided his gaze, rushing through the remaining lecture points. Carter noticed the change. He always noticed every detail. But outside that room, a different kind of math was unfolding. The kind that had nothing to do with equations. That evening, a faculty roundtable convened. An unofficial meeting, cloaked in academic civility, but fueled by tension. Dr. Herschel sat at the head, flanked by Professor Wolf, Dr. Marcus Hill from admissions, and two other faculty members who specialized in curriculum evaluation. The lights were dim. The discussion began sterile, as they always did. Questions about teaching pace, group cohesion, and student synergy. But it didn't stay neutral for long. Professor Wolf folded his hands and leaned forward. "He's smart," he said. "No one's disputing that. But the question is whether he can thrive here socially." Dr. Hill nodded slowly. "We also need to consider whether his placement was too aggressive. The testing system has flaws. Outliers slip through." "Outliers?" Dr. Fiona Maris, one of the quieter attendees, raised an eyebrow. "You mean gifted students?" Wolf avoided her gaze. "I mean anomalies. Statistically rare cases. And it's not just ability. He lacks the polish, the pedigree. It's disruptive." The word lingered. Disruptive. Dr. Herschel kept her voice low. "We're receiving attention. Parents are asking questions. Donors are watching. We can't afford a media misunderstanding." They didn't talk about Carter's intelligence. Not directly. They talked around it as if his achievements were tricks or coincidences. A statistical blip that needed correcting, not nurturing. Dr. Maris tried again. "He's clearly gifted. If anything, we should be spotlighting him, showing what our program can uncover." But Dr. Hill leaned back and shook his head. "Gifted, maybe, but unscalable. We're not structured for this. We don't have the resources to support someone with his particular trajectory." By the end of the meeting, an unofficial consensus had been reached. There was no vote, no formal notice, just quiet agreement. They would restructure the cohort. They would adjust the curriculum placements. They would redirect Carter. None of this would be said out loud. No official record. Just action. That night, back in the dormitory, Carter sat on his bed with his notebook open. His roommate, Jared, a wealthy sophomore from Connecticut, barely acknowledged him. The room was silent, except for the scratching of Carter's pencil, as he worked through problems on multivariable calculus. He didn't know it yet, but those notes would never be reviewed. His next session wouldn't happen. The next morning, a quiet email was sent, not to Carter or his mother, but to a secondary office assistant tasked with placement updates. It simply stated, "Student KM to be reassigned to General Math Workshop. Effective immediately." No explanation. No context. No conversation. Elsewhere on campus, Dr. Herschel closed her laptop and sipped her coffee, already moving on to other matters. Because what none of them realized was that someone else had been listening. A custodian, Mr. Clarence Doyle, had overheard the tail end of the faculty meeting. He was an older man, invisible to most, sweeping floors and clearing trash from classrooms. But he had been on campus for over 30 years, and he had seen this before. And now, Carter. That night, Mr. Doyle lingered in the hallway near Carter's dorm. When the boy stepped out to get water, Doyle spoke. "You're the kid who solved Wolf's problem without notes, right?" Carter blinked, cautious. "Yes, sir. You got a good head on you. Better than they want to admit." Carter didn't respond, but the words stuck. "You ever seen someone try to shrink the sun?" Doyle added. "Don't mean the sun ain't burning." It was the first time in days that someone had spoken to him like he mattered. Meanwhile, across town, Elise Milton, Carter's mother, sat in her small hotel room, filling out time cards on her laptop. She hadn't received any updates from the program in over 48 hours. No emails, no calls, and her gut began to churn. Something was wrong. She fired off a message to the program director. No response. Back at Harvard, the next day arrived. Carter prepared for his usual session, bag packed, brain buzzing with formula. Room change. Group C reassigned to Math Lab B's second floor. He made his way there, confused. This wasn't advanced mathematics. This was remedial review. Carter stood frozen, clutching his notebook. He approached the instructor. I think I'm in the wrong room. The woman glanced at her list. Carter Milton? He nodded. No, you're on here. He blinked. There must be a mistake. I was in Professor Wolf's class. She paused, then smiled weakly. They told me this is your new assignment. No explanation. No reason. Just like that. He had been moved. An official decision is made without informing Carter or his family. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of Sanders Hall, casting long golden beams across the floor. As students shuffled into their seats, it was supposed to be a normal day, the last lecture before the final exam. A day charged with quiet anticipation. Carter entered the classroom just as he always did. Head down, hoodie sleeves slightly pulled over his hands, notebook tucked under his arm. But the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt it. A stillness. A shift. The kind of tension that hums beneath the surface when something has been decided behind closed doors. He took his seat in the front row, just as he had every day, unaware that this day would not end, like the others. The whispers had grown quieter, but the stares were heavier. Some students looked through him now. Others who had once engaged him in friendly debate avoided eye contact. Professor Wolf stood at the podium, flipping through a thin folder with deliberate slowness. His face gave nothing away. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about math. Before we begin, Wolf said, voice flat, there's an administrative matter we need to handle. No one moved. Carter, sensing something unfamiliar in the tone, looked up. Wolf continued. Carter Milton, could you please gather your things? The words struck like a thunderclap in a silent storm. Carter blinked, confused. Sir? He asked. Wolf didn't look up. You've been reassigned. Please gather your belongings. Just like that. No explanation. No eye contact. No warning. Outside the classroom, he sat on the stairwell, eyes unfocused, chest tight. He didn't cry. He didn't have to. The ache wasn't sharp. It was dull, deep, and heavy. He thought of every question he had answered, every step he had walked to get there, and all of it now felt like it had never mattered. And just down the hall, his mother was arriving, called in for an impromptu placement meeting, with no prior notice. Elise Milton walked in with her head held high, her eyes sharp, her instincts already bracing for what she didn't yet know. Inside the administrative office, she was met by a man in a navy vest, Assistant Dean Troy Kendall, who greeted her with a practiced smile. Thank you for coming, Miss Milton, he said. Elise didn't sit. What's going on with my son? She asked directly. Kendall offered a neutral shrug. Concerns? She echoed. Like what? His intelligence? His skin? Kendall remained quiet, offering instead a pre-filled release form. If you'd prefer to withdraw him, we can expedite the process. Elise stared at the paper, her hands clenched. She found Carter sitting alone, head down, back hunched over his notebook. When he looked up, Elise didn't need to ask. She saw it in his eyes, the silence, the pain. She sat beside him and wrapped her arm around his shoulder. They didn't even give me a reason, he said quietly. Carter stood after a moment, something sharp returning to his eyes. I need to see something, he muttered. He walked back toward the classroom where he'd been removed, standing just outside the door. Through the narrow window he could see Professor Wolf lecturing again, as if nothing had happened. But something caught Carter's eye. On the desk near the podium lay the final exam booklet, left open, exposed, the very thing he had spent weeks preparing for, now denied to him. And in that moment, as he stared at the questions meant to measure brilliance, Carter realized something else. The test wasn't the real challenge. The system was. Carter notices the final exam booklet still lying open on the professor's desk. Carter didn't move from the hallway bench for a long time. His backpack sat slumped beside him, untouched. His notebook lay closed in his lap, its pages filled with brilliance no one wanted to see. Across the hall through the narrow glass of the lecture room door, the class continued without him. The hum of discussion, the scrape of chalk on the board, it all moved on as if he hadn't existed. His shoulders hunched, hoodie pulled forward like armor. He wasn't crying, not anymore. The tears had come earlier, quiet and fast, swallowed by the stillness of the hallway. Now, there was only stillness, and silence, and the slow thudding ache of being dismissed. But inside that ache, something else began to stir. Carter's eyes drifted to the floor, where a sliver of sunlight lit up a patch of tiles. His fingers tapped gently on the edge of his notebook, then stopped. His mind wasn't blank. Far from it. He closed his eyes, and then, softly, barely a whisper, he began to solve. His lips moved, as if possessed. One by one, he unraveled the pieces. His brain didn't just recall the problem, it reconstructed it. Line by line, step by step, as though the page were in front of him. Carter had never needed to memorize like others. His brain stored it mapped. His mother had known since he was 5 and recited the entire back page of a cereal box, word for word after glancing at it once. But here, in the heart of Harvard's legacy, his gift was seen not as genius but as disruption. He moved to the next imaginary problem, adjusting for pattern, syntax, and notation. He solved again and again. 10 problems. No scratch paper. No calculator. Just his mind, moving through space like a dancer through air. Mr. Clarence Doyle had been working custodial at Harvard for over 30 years. He'd seen protests come and go, dorms change names, buildings get remodeled. But one thing never changed: who got believed and who got dismissed. He'd seen too many black students, quiet geniuses, silenced by red tape and cold stares. But something about this boy was different. He paused, mop in hand, unnoticed. Carter sat with his head slightly down, still speaking, eyes flickering beneath his lids like someone dreaming wide awake. Limit approaching 0 from the right. Multiply by conjugate. Result simplifies to. Mr. Doyle stepped closer. You solving in your head, son? He asked gently. Carter jumped slightly, caught mid-thought, blinking at the unexpected presence.
Just something from class, he replied, his voice quiet, cautious.
What class? Doyle asked. Carter hesitated. Doesn't matter. I got pulled out. Mr. Doyle leaned his mop against the wall and lowered himself slowly onto the bench beside the boy. That your choice? No, sir. Did you cheat? Carter looked up sharply. No. Doyle nodded, slow and steady. Didn't think so. Carter looked back down at his hands. They said it was about group pacing, but I know what it was. I raised my hand too much. Got too many answers right. Made the wrong people look wrong. Mr. Doyle studied the boy. And now you're sitting here solving problems for a test they never intended to give you. Silence. I remember another kid, Doyle said quietly. Back in '03, girl named Sierra, physics whiz. First black girl in a competitive robotics track. Knew more about magnetic fields than her professor did. They said she was too aggressive. Removed her before the finals. I cleaned out her dorm after she left. Books still on the bed. Carter didn't speak, but his jaw clenched. You remind me of her, Doyle continued. Not just 'cause you're smart, but 'cause you make 'em uncomfortable. You walk in with your own light, and it messes with their shadows. Carter swallowed hard. Then what do I do? Just sit here while they erase me? Doyle shook his head. You solve. You keep solving. Let them build walls. You go around them, over them, under them, if you have to. The hallway was still. A slow intensity returned to Carter's gaze. He flipped open his notebook and began scribbling. Problem after problem. Equations from memory. Solutions recited in whispers. It wasn't just studying. It was resistance. Doyle watched, then slowly pulled out his old flip phone. The camera was terrible, the audio grainy, but he hit record anyway. Say that last one again, he said. Carter paused. You recording me? Sure am. Someone ought to see what they just threw away. Carter looked uncertain, but then nodded. He started again, voice clearer now. Doyle filmed as the boy moved through complex theorems, with no notes, no calculator, no hesitation. Down the hallway, unseen and unheard, a shadow moved behind a partially closed office door. It was Dr. Fiona Maris. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but when she heard the whispering echo of math recitations, she had paused. And what she saw through the sliver in the doorframe shook her. She saw truth, a boy discarded by protocol, now rebuilding the test from memory, flawlessly, uncoached. Her heart tightened. She had sat through that faculty meeting. She hadn't spoken up loud enough. And now, watching Carter work from the shadows, she realized he wasn't the disruption. They were. She stepped back quietly, unsure of what she would do next. But she knew this moment wasn't just about math. It was about a child who refused to be erased. A janitor witnesses him reciting solutions from a final exam he never took. Elise Milton stood outside the administrative building with her fists clenched, the veins in her hands rising beneath her skin like rivers of pressure trying not to burst. Her heels dug into the concrete as she stared up at the ivy-draped brick. The same walls that had welcomed her son with smiles just 2 weeks ago. Now those same smiles had faded into masks, tight-lipped, guarded, rehearsed. They had removed her child like a stain from silk, quietly, efficiently, without cause. She had received no emails, no calls explaining the reassignment, no academic concerns filed. Just a sudden shift. One day Carter was a star student, in an advanced math seminar. The next he was cast into a remedial room with kids who hadn't even seen calculus. Elise had watched the light in his eyes dull by degrees over 3 sleepless nights. He hadn't asked her to fix it, but that made her fury burn hotter. He had learned too early how systems shut down voices like his. Inside the lobby, she walked with a precision that warned anyone who might dare approach her. Her presence was no longer that of a proud parent. It was of a woman standing in a burning house, demanding to know who lit the match. She waited 15 minutes before the receptionist reluctantly paged an academic liaison. Assistant Dean Kendall returned with his signature performative calm. Elise noticed the same expressions she'd seen on hospital staff, who prepared to give bad news without letting it feel personal. He spoke in practiced neutrality, layered with gentle disclaimers and non-committal pauses. The explanation was a maze of jargon. Phrases like classroom fit, cohort cohesion, and curricular recalibration echoed off the office walls. Every sentence sounded like it had passed through a public relations filter before ever reaching her ears. The language was perfectly designed to say everything and nothing. Elise listened, unmoving. The deeper he spoke, the more she saw it. Not just evasion, but insulation. She had stepped into a place built to protect itself from accountability. Every hallway, every policy, every smiling administrator was part of a machinery designed to neutralize discomfort, and her son's excellence had made them uncomfortable. She pressed again. What specific policy allowed a child to be reassigned, without parental notification? What behavior had Carter exhibited that raised flags? What academic data suggested he was struggling? No answers came. Only referrals. Only recommendations to submit inquiries through the proper channels. Elise realized then that the answers didn't exist, because the decision hadn't been about performance. It had been about presence. Carter's presence had disrupted the narrative, one they were desperate to keep intact. She left the building without another word, walking past the iconic statues and old stone columns that now felt hostile in their silence. The campus pride banners fluttered softly in the breeze above her head. Equity, empowerment, access, hollow words on high thread count fabric. Back in her hotel room, Elise sat at the edge of the bed, staring at her laptop. Carter had gone quiet again. He was lying on the couch nearby, lost in equations, trying to build walls against the world outside. She opened her social media page, hands trembling slightly. She hadn't planned to say anything publicly, but that plan crumbled the moment she remembered her son, walking out of that classroom, his dignity folded into the pages of his untouched notebook. With slow, deliberate keystrokes, she began to write. The post wasn't angry. It was surgical. She told the story. A 13-year-old black boy accepted into an elite Ivy League math program. A child who solved complex equations from memory, who surpassed expectation, who made no enemies, broke no rules, and was still removed without explanation. She didn't name the professor. She didn't insult the institution. But she told the truth plainly, and the truth was radioactive. She hit post. It started slowly, just a few likes, then a handful of shares from old friends, colleagues from her job back in Dallas, teachers from Carter's old school. But within the hour, a ripple had begun. A math teacher in Atlanta shared it, adding a comment about systemic gatekeeping. Then a STEM advocacy group reposted it. Then a civil rights account. Then a journalist. By midnight, the post had reached 20,000 views. By morning, it was nearing 6 figures. The comments flooded in. Parents, educators, students, strangers who saw themselves in her words. Many shared stories of similar erasure, veiled racism, and coded decisions designed to keep brilliance invisible when it came in the wrong color. Elise watched the numbers rise, not with satisfaction, but with sorrow. She hadn't wanted to go public. She had hoped for resolution within the walls of Harvard. But those walls weren't built for voices like hers. They were built to echo themselves. As the post gained traction, Elise began receiving messages, not just support, but resistance. Anonymous emails calling her dramatic, accusations of reverse discrimination, claims that her son was a publicity stunt, One message suggested she was weaponizing race. It didn't surprise her. It enraged her. She turned the phone over and looked at Carter. He was asleep now, curled up on the sofa, notebook still in his hand, pencil loose between his fingers. Even in sleep, his brow furrowed, as if solving something too big to be written down. She reached for the blanket, covering him gently. Then her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a comment or message. It was a share notification from someone unexpected. A professor, Dr. Fiona Maris. She had shared Elise's post with the caption, "I was there, I watched what happened, and I can no longer stay silent." Elise makes a public Facebook post that begins to go viral. By the time dawn broke over Harvard's quiet cobblestone walkways, the post had already crossed the invisible line from concerned testimony to national story. Elise Milton's words had leapt from timelines to inboxes, from quiet corners of Black parenting groups to the trending tabs of major platforms. The numbers weren't just rising, they were multiplying. Screenshots spread like fire. Her son's name, once hidden in the shadows of the institution, now appeared in headlines and hashtags. Carter Milton was no longer just a gifted boy wrongfully removed from a classroom. He was becoming a symbol of suppression, of quiet injustice, of the way elite institutions still reflexively swatted away Black brilliance. When it became too visible, Elise hadn't asked for this kind of attention, but it arrived regardless. Her inbox swelled with interview requests, speaking offers, advocacy groups wanting to collaborate, and even documentary interest. The weight of it was dizzying. Back on campus, however, the response was not dizzying. It was surgical. The Harvard Communications Office sprang into coordinated motion by 9 a.m. Public relations staff met behind closed doors in a long glass-walled conference room that looked more like a strategy bunker than a space for reflection. They moved quickly. Drafts were reviewed, talking points prepared, potential legal risks assessed. The goal was clear: minimize fallout, control narrative, and most of all, avoid liability. Their first move was to deny. A carefully crafted university statement was posted on their official site and distributed to select media outlets. It was laced with ambiguity, wrapped in polished phrases like "we remain committed to academic excellence and inclusivity," and "placement decisions are made holistically with student development in mind." The words sounded noble to the untrained ear, but to anyone paying attention, they were the kind of phrases institutions use to step away from the fire without getting burned. But the fire didn't die. It spread. An anonymous faculty email address began leaking messages. First quietly, then explosively. The emails were internal communications between senior staff members. One read, "We can't let one anomaly derail the group environment." Another, "It's unfortunate, but we have to think long-term. Legacy families are watching." The final blow came from an exchange flagged between Dr. Wolf and another professor. "He's too fast, too visible, too much of a variable for stability." Screenshots of these emails hit the internet like lightning bolts. No names were redacted. No doubt remained. What had been speculation was now corroborated. The institution that had claimed to champion diversity was now exposed for something far more familiar: preserving comfort over justice, image over merit. Inside her modest hotel room, Elise read the leaks with shaking hands. It was surreal, watching the mask fall from a place she had once believed in. But beneath the wave of vindication came a deeper kind of grief. Because this wasn't just about Harvard, it was about every door that slammed quietly on Black talent, every opportunity stolen behind the shield of polished language. Carter sat beside her, silent. His name had become a headline, but he still carried the bruises of erasure. Even as people celebrated his mind online, he knew how little it had mattered to those in power. Praise couldn't erase the humiliation he'd felt walking out of that classroom, carrying a bag heavier with silence than with books. Back at Harvard, panic was no longer private. Students had begun organizing impromptu conversations in dorm lounges and dining halls. Posters with Carter's face started appearing across campus, his name in bold print above quotes from the leaked emails. Some students rallied for justice. Others, quietly uncomfortable, distanced themselves with murmurs about context and misunderstanding. Faculty divided quickly. Those who had once hidden behind neutrality were now pressed to choose sides. Dr. Fiona Maris, the same professor who had witnessed Carter's mental solving session, made her first formal statement. In an open letter addressed to the administration, she wrote, "The removal of Carter Milton was not about curriculum. It was about containment. I regret my silence during that meeting. But I will not be silent now." Her words carried weight. For years, Dr. Maris had played by the rules, believed in the system's ability to evolve, but watching Carter's brilliance discarded changed something in her. She had watched too many black students suffocate under the illusion of inclusion. This time, she refused to be complicit. Within hours, her letter was picked up by academic blogs and featured on national news platforms. Harvard's carefully polished narrative began to splinter. And then, an unexpected twist. Elise received a private message. It was simple, just a name, a phone number, and a note. "I taught there for 7 years. We need to talk. This goes deeper than you think." The name stopped her cold. Dr. Jeremiah Ford. She remembered him. Barely. He had been a rising star in theoretical mathematics, a black professor who had appeared on education panels, talked about innovation in teaching, and had once been profiled as the future of STEM equity at Harvard. Then, without warning, he had disappeared. No press. No goodbye, just vanished from faculty pages. Elise stared at the message for a long time before calling. On the other end, Dr. Ford answered. His voice was quiet, measured, but each word carried gravity. He told her about patterns, about young black scholars pushed into silence or steered away from visibility, about gifted students who were promised opportunity, then penalized for achieving too fast, too loud, too visibly. He spoke of a culture that didn't just resist change, it buried it beneath policy, denial, and bureaucratic fog. He had left when he realized he wasn't losing a fight. He was being erased slowly, methodically, and politely. His departure hadn't been dramatic. That's how they preferred it. Quiet exits, no mess, just silence. But watching Carter's story explode had awakened something in him. He warned Elise that Harvard's next move wouldn't be retaliation. It would be redirection. They'd offer soft apologies, create initiatives, and try to absorb the story into a controlled narrative. They'd make Carter a symbol without giving him real access. They'd wrap the wound with banners and slogans, never admitting it was self-inflicted. Elise listened, each word cementing what she already knew in her bones. The fight ahead wouldn't just be about justice. It would be about truth, visibility, and refusing to let their carefully built silence swallow her son's voice. A former black professor reaches out to Elise with a warning. Jeremiah Ford's voice was calm, but underneath it pulsed the tremor of restrained memory, years of silence, of watching, of choosing what to say and what to bury. As Elise listened over the phone, her eyes stayed locked on the hotel room window. Outside, Boston moved like it always did. Slow traffic, students on bikes, vendors opening shop, but inside, the world was cracking open. Ford wasn't calling to speculate. He was calling to confirm what Elise already sensed, that Carter's removal wasn't a fluke, but a practiced pattern, a decision that had been made before, to others, in boardrooms that smelled of polished oak and quiet power. But this time, the mistake they made was public and viral. Ford recounted it all. The names didn't need to be changed, because none of them had been remembered. There was Malik, a black freshman who had rewritten a theorem during his first semester, but was later redirected to a different major after being labeled difficult to mentor. There was Ayana, a sophomore whose research project had outperformed 3 faculty-led grants, but who was told she lacked team cohesion. Then there was Ellis, a prodigy in data systems, who disappeared from the campus entirely after a sudden academic reassessment. Ford had watched them vanish one by one. Some left with resistance, others with quiet heartbreak. The Ivy League had perfected a language of disqualification so refined it sounded like guidance. Phrases like academic alignment, growth redirection, and social independence masked what was, at its core, fear. Fear of talent that couldn't be controlled. Fear of excellence that came wrapped in skin the institution still did not know how to honor. He told Elise that the problem wasn't just in the classrooms, it was institutional. He described how tenure-track black professors were often praised in public, but undermined in committee rooms. Their research proposals got delayed. Their mentorship styles were reviewed. And when they challenged the status quo, they were gently nudged toward better fits elsewhere. Always with a handshake. Always with a smile. That was how he had left. Ford had once believed he could change things from the inside. He had spent years trying to outpace the system's resistance to people like him. But in the end, the walls didn't budge. They just closed in tighter. And then he paused. There was something else. A document. He told Elise he still had a copy of the final exam. The one Carter had never been allowed to take. It had been shared with him by a friend who remained on faculty, disillusioned but too entangled to speak out. Ford hadn't planned on using it, but now watching the world pay attention to a child being cast aside for being too extraordinary, he knew it had to be seen. He emailed it before hanging up. When Elise opened the attachment, her breath caught. There it was. The full exam. 14 questions across multiple disciplines: calculus, logic proofs, systems theory, abstract modeling. It was designed to separate the best from the rest. Timed, scaled, and impossible for most. But as Elise scrolled through it, her mind wasn't on the questions. It was on her son, sitting across the room, sketching figures across pages that no one had asked to see. She closed the laptop and looked at him. Carter hadn't spoken much since the leak went public. The media attention hadn't soothed him. It had spotlighted a wound that still pulsed raw. For him, the story wasn't about proving himself. He already had. It was about understanding why brilliance in his body was considered threatening. Elise sat beside him and placed the printed exam pages on the table. She said nothing. She didn't frame it as a challenge or a test, just something she thought he might want to see. He glanced at the first question and blinked. Then his pencil moved. Not fast, not showy, but steady, accurate. He whispered the logic to himself as he wrote, not realizing Elise had begun recording, not for the world, but for herself. For the memory of this moment, for proof that her child had never needed their permission to be exceptional. He moved through each problem like he was untying a rope that others thought was knotted beyond repair. What had been withheld as a form of punishment now became a canvas for clarity. Outside the room, the narrative continued to twist. Media coverage had reached national news. University alumni were beginning to split, some calling for investigations, others defending the institution as victims of viral distortion. But the leaked emails, the testimonies, and now the growing list of faculty who had begun to speak up made it harder for Harvard to control the direction of the storm. And yet, through all the noise, something quieter was happening. Messages began arriving, not just for Elise, but for Dr. Ford. They came from junior professors, from admissions staff, from graduate students who had been watching for years, afraid to speak. They shared fragments, internal memos, denied grant applications, mentorship opportunities revoked, under the guise of departmental restructuring. Piece by piece, a pattern was forming, one that couldn't be denied, one that painted a clear picture. Black excellence wasn't being nurtured at Harvard, it was being managed, controlled, and when it grew too bright, extinguished. Dr. Ford compiled everything. An anonymous source volunteered to create a digital archive, a central site. Every testimony, every document, every email, protected, verified, and visible. It wouldn't be just about Carter. It would be about every voice silenced in the name of tradition. But first, Ford needed proof that Carter wasn't just exceptional. He was undeniable. He called Elise again that evening. He told her something she hadn't expected. He wanted to submit Carter's test results to a closed consortium of mathematicians, an elite panel of experts who had no stake in the university's politics. They would review the answers blindly, not knowing who wrote them, not knowing the age, just the work. If the results came back as flawless, Ford believed it would be the final push, not for redemption, but for disruption, a redefinition of who was allowed to be labeled gifted. Elise hesitated, not because she doubted her son, but because she feared what the institution might do next. But Ford assured her, this time, they wouldn't be able to hide behind policy. They would be forced to confront a truth too bright to dim. And with that, he pressed send on one more email. The exam, the solution sheets, no name attached, just raw genius. Dr. Ford sends Elise the full final exam and asks her to let Carter try it. The room was still. Afternoon light poured through the blinds in quiet slats, casting long shadows across the floor. Carter sat cross-legged on the edge of the hotel bed, the final exam resting on his lap. Printed pages, clean and crisp, held questions that were never meant to reach him. Each problem was a gate, constructed to test the most advanced minds, deliberately complex, deliberately intimidating. And yet his hands remained still. No pen, no calculator, no notebook. Across the room, Elise positioned her phone discreetly, not to pressure him, but to preserve the moment. She knew what her son was capable of. She had seen it in glimpses, solving advanced puzzles in the car, reciting solutions in his sleep, mapping algorithms in the condensation on a window pane. But this was different. This was a reckoning, not against the exam, but against the silence that had tried to define him. Carter stared at the first question. His lips didn't move, but something behind his eyes lit up, like gears engaging deep inside his mind. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his gaze as if drawing the numbers into place, without needing to write them. The page became unnecessary. His brain was the canvas. The first problem required advanced integration, nested functions, trigonometric manipulation, substitutions designed to twist logic into knots. But for Carter, the layers peeled away effortlessly. He didn't need to jot down steps or verify derivatives. He traced the flow of the equation in his head, watched the pieces align, and arrived at the answer. Then he turned to the next question. And then the next. With each page, he breathed a little deeper, not from exertion, but from control, from reclaiming what had been stolen. These were the problems he had been deemed unfit to solve. Yet now, in silence, he moved through them with surgical precision. It wasn't just intelligence. It was a kind of internal language. Where others memorized, Carter understood. Where others followed steps, Carter saw the answer before the work had been drawn. Elise didn't interrupt. She didn't ask how it was going. She just recorded frame after frame her child dismantling an Ivy League exam in real time, with nothing but thought. Hours passed, but Carter didn't falter. He paused between sections only to blink, breathe, and recalibrate. Some problems required abstract modeling. Others invoked logic statements that seemed to contradict themselves, designed to confuse. Yet Carter found the seams. He recognized patterns the moment they emerged. Even in chaos, he saw the architecture. As the final page turned, his fingers hovered over it for a second. He looked out the window, not for help, not for reassurance, but for clarity. The last question was the hardest. It involved multi-dimensional matrices and nonlinear constraints, a type of problem even seasoned grad students struggled with. But he'd seen its skeleton before, in a book long forgotten, in a theory he'd once tried to reimagine on a napkin during lunch. Now it was here, and in under 6 minutes, it was solved. He exhaled slowly and set the pages aside. His hands hadn't touched a pencil. The paper was still blank, but the work had been done, all of it, inside his mind. Elise ended the recording and looked at her son. She didn't need validation. She didn't need an official score. What she'd witnessed was the truth. Unfiltered, undeniable, and she knew the world had to see it. But even as she uploaded the video to a private platform and prepared to share it, a flicker of hesitation gripped her. She was no stranger to the internet. She had watched how it could uplift and destroy in the same breath. Once the world saw Carter, there would be no undoing it. He would no longer be a boy with a quiet gift. He would become a story, a symbol, a target. Still, she clicked publish. The video went live. Within minutes it began to spread, first through the activist networks that had already rallied behind Carter's name, then into academic circles, and eventually into the mainstream. It wasn't just that a child had solved Harvard's exam mentally. It was how he did it. Calmly, flawlessly, unapologetically, no theatrics, no performance. Just pure cognitive power on display. Every solution aligned with the original answer key Dr. Ford had provided. Mathematicians in the comments began fact-checking and confirming point by point. Engineers, professors, and data scientists from around the world shared the footage, calling it historic, unprecedented, genius unfolding in real time. Carter's face, once ignored in a classroom, now appeared in thumbnail after thumbnail across social platforms. Some praised, some questioned, some doubted, but no one could look away. And while Harvard remained publicly silent, the pressure was building. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings were called. Legal teams reviewed every frame of the video. Administrators debated damage control strategies. Should they acknowledge the footage, discredit it, ignore it altogether? But it was too late. The footage had escaped the bubble. It was no longer just a story about exclusion. It was now a global conversation about how systems fail when brilliance doesn't look how they expect. The video is uploaded, and it explodes online. The numbers didn't just climb, they surged. Within 48 hours of the video's release, Carter's mental unraveling of Harvard's final exam had been viewed over 6 million times, then 10, then 17. The footage, raw, quiet, deliberate, spread across every major platform, stitched into threads, clipped into reels, embedded in articles. It was reposted by mathematicians in Mumbai, scholars in Ghana, software engineers in Silicon Valley, and high schoolers in Chicago. No music, no edits, no hype, just a boy, unmoved, solving what an institution had decided was beyond his place. The hashtags rose quickly. Let Carter learn. Black brilliance blocked. Harvard silences genius. What started as a call-out became a call to action. Morning shows picked it up next. Anchors stumbled over equations while trying to summarize the video. News panels debated whether it was staged, only to be corrected live by guests who confirmed the math as irrefutably correct. Commentators with decades of experience in education policy admitted they had never seen anything like it. Carter's name became impossible to ignore. But even as the world celebrated his mind, the center of the storm, Harvard remained cold. Inside Massachusetts Hall, the administration met in emergency clusters, speaking in legal tones and policy euphemisms. Rather than acknowledge what had happened, they issued a new statement. It was twice as long as the first, and said even less. Buried within it was a single sentence that sparked immediate fury. While we remain committed to diversity and inclusion, we also maintain rigorous academic standards and procedures to ensure integrity. Integrity. The word hit like a slap. After weeks of silence, that was the line Harvard chose to draw. The implication wasn't subtle. It wasn't even coded. It suggested that Carter's performance might not be legitimate. That perhaps his brilliance was somehow contaminated. That the footage, despite its clarity, deserved doubt. The backlash was instant. Civil rights leaders issued statements condemning the university's response. Dr. Bernice Kinsey, a former federal education commissioner, described it as intellectual redlining. Attorney Benjamin Childs appeared on national television, comparing Harvard's behavior to legacy discrimination, dressed in academic robes. And then came the celebrities. A-list actors reposted the video with captions like, "We see you, Carter." Athletes shared it, writing, "This is what a real prodigy looks like." One best-selling author offered to fund Carter's education anywhere in the world. A famous rapper posted, "This young king just cracked the system with silence." Yet, the more people rallied behind Carter, the more Harvard pulled inward. Staff were instructed not to comment. Professors were told to refer all inquiries to the communications office. Internal channels were monitored, but silence only made the noise louder. Then, quietly, another leak dropped. This one wasn't from a faculty meeting. It was from the Office of Student Data. An unnamed source released an internal review from months prior, one that showed Carter's original placement exam had scored higher than every other student in the summer program. He hadn't just been qualified. He had led the cohort from day one. The document, signed and dated, confirmed what the world now knew. He had been removed not because he was unfit, but because he had disrupted a narrative too fragile to handle his brilliance. The hypocrisy pierced through every defense Harvard tried to muster, and people began asking deeper questions, not just about Carter, but about the structure itself. How many others had been quietly removed? How often had black students been told they didn't belong, not because of behavior or grades, but because of fear? Old stories resurfaced. Alumni came forward with testimonies about cultural mismatch evaluations, professionalism concerns, and mysteriously withdrawn opportunities. A pattern emerged, a legacy of quiet removals, of silent decisions that left no fingerprints but plenty of damage. And amid the storm, Carter remained grounded. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't speak on camera. He stayed with Elise in the hotel, spending his time reviewing the work of mathematicians who looked like him, hidden legends he hadn't been taught in school. He read about Benjamin Banneker, Euphemia Lofton-Haynes, Katherine Johnson, men and women who had rewritten equations while being ignored by the institutions they served. He wasn't angry. He was awake. And that scared Harvard more than anything else, because this wasn't just a child who could outperform their best. It was a child who understood why they didn't want him to. Then came the twist no one expected. An open-source group of educators and software developers, inspired by Carter's video, launched a virtual math platform in his name, the Carter Method. Within a week, over 30,000 students had signed up. The mission: to teach advanced mathematics through mental mapping, logical visualization, and memory techniques modeled after Carter's methods. Elise hadn't even approved it yet, but the momentum was already alive. It was no longer just about Harvard. It was about a generation inspired by a boy who had been told to sit down and decided to stand without moving. And then, the final spark. An online petition appeared, simple in design but explosive in language. We demand a federal investigation into Harvard's discriminatory practices against black students in advanced programs. Within 12 hours, it had 50,000 signatures. Within 24, it crossed 300. The pressure was no longer just social, it was political. Lawmakers began to circle. Education committees took notice. News anchors ended their shows with segments titled, "When the Best is Black and Still Denied." Harvard couldn't hide behind its logo anymore. And somewhere deep inside its oldest building, a boardroom fell into silence as the first formal letter from a congressional oversight committee landed on the president's desk. A petition emerges demanding an investigation into Harvard's discrimination. The wave didn't crest, it crashed. By the time Carter's video had circled the globe, it wasn't just a viral moment. It was a cultural shift. Newsrooms scrambled to cover the story, each angling for an exclusive on the boy who had solved Harvard's final exam with nothing but his mind. Morning talk shows spoke of him in awe, while nightly panels dissected every second of the footage. Yet the more exposure the video received, the more the story fractured between celebration and suspicion, admiration and denial. Major media networks rushed to brand him as a genius. But not all coverage was kind. On one side, scholars praised Carter's mental agility as historic. On the other, cable news skeptics picked at the narrative, suggesting Elise had manipulated public sympathy, or that the video had been cleverly edited. Some questioned whether the exam itself was even real. Others accused the family of exploiting a moment for fame. Elise watched it unfold with careful detachment, knowing the line between recognition and ridicule was thin and rapidly eroding. Still, the academic world held firm. Mathematicians from across the globe confirmed the test's legitimacy and complexity. Harvard's own former faculty whispered confirmations through encrypted emails and quiet phone calls. A respected professor from Cambridge publicly validated Carter's solutions step by step, while a renowned theorist from Tokyo called his cognitive precision an event of academic importance. Scientific journals began referencing Carter's methods in discussions on intuitive problem solving. And yet, the louder experts spoke, the more defensive certain media outlets became. Harvard, caught in the eye of the storm, refused to shift. They neither apologized nor clarified. Instead, their silence hardened. Meanwhile, more internal documents surfaced, leaking like cracks in a dam. Emails revealed deliberate conversations about minimizing distraction, avoiding donor discomfort, and realigning media narratives. Each leak added fuel to an already furious public discourse. It wasn't just about Carter anymore, it was about the system and who it chose to recognize. Inside their modest hotel room, Elise kept her son shielded from the noise. She monitored the internet from her phone while Carter sat quietly, withdrawn from the attention. The boy who once scribbled numbers into every notebook now filled pages with sketches, patterns of circles and arcs, silent spirals that meant something only to him. Elise knew this was his way of staying afloat, of turning inward when the world became too loud. He didn't speak much. When he did, his questions were never about fame. He asked why institutions feared brilliance when it came in bodies like his. He asked why systems built for knowledge so often collapsed when truth didn't come from a familiar source. He was trying to map something bigger than equations. He was trying to understand power. And then it arrived. A sleek email from a major television network. A prime-time feature. A special episode. Extraordinary Minds Live. The premise was clear. Carter would solve problems on live television. No cuts, no edits. The questions would be sourced from an elite panel of university mathematicians, broadcast to millions. They positioned it as an honor. Elise read the message 3 times. She could smell the strategy, curiosity wrapped in a spectacle. But behind the flash she also saw something else. Opportunity. Not just to prove anything, but to force the world to watch uninterrupted, unfiltered. She didn't answer immediately. She called Dr. Ford first, letting the idea breathe. He paused, then said gently, "It's risky. But if he says yes, they won't be able to look away." That night, Elise sat beside Carter and shared the invitation. He didn't flinch. He didn't even seem surprised. He stared out the window, eyes tracing the Boston skyline, then turned to her with the kind of quiet resolve that said more than words. He nodded once. That was enough. A live TV invitation is sent for Carter to solve problems in real time. The studio lights were relentless, white hot and sterile, aimed to strip away every shadow, every flicker of uncertainty. The stage had been transformed into a kind of intellectual arena. Two glass whiteboards mounted on rolling stands, a digital timer projected above them, and four cameras trained at different angles. In the corner, a panel of professors from prestigious institutions, Stanford, MIT, Columbia, sat behind a long desk, their expressions guarded. This wasn't just a feature, it was a spectacle dressed as assessment. Carter stood center stage. No desk, no notes, just a single marker in his hand, and a calm, unreadable gaze. He wore a plain charcoal hoodie and dark jeans. No stylists, no press handlers, no earpieces. Elise stood just off stage, her heart pounding beneath her ribs, like a war drum. The host, a familiar face from network television, gave a practiced smile as she addressed the audience. The crowd behind her, an invite-only mix of journalists, educators, and influencers, waited in charged silence. Millions watched from home. Live streams flickered across time zones. The producers had advertised the event as the Genius Hour, but what everyone really wanted to see was whether a 13-year-old black boy could do what Harvard had claimed he couldn't. The host began with a warm-up question. A basic integral college level, but straightforward. Carter didn't hesitate. He glanced at the equation once, turned toward the board, and wrote the answer in 5 seconds. The room shifted. The next problem appeared more complex. A proof requiring the identification of a false premise embedded in a recursive function. Again, Carter examined the question with eerie stillness, then delivered the correct logical sequence before the panel could finish whispering among themselves. The host's polished veneer began to slip. The speed, the clarity. It wasn't just impressive, it was unsettling. Television thrived on drama, on tension, on missteps that built suspense. But Carter wasn't giving them any. He was giving precision. Question 3 was handpicked by the MIT representative. A problem involving multiple variable limits in a discontinuous space. One even graduate students approached with caution. Carter tilted his head slightly, closed his eyes for 6 seconds, then turned and wrote the final expression in a single clean motion. Gasps rippled across the audience. The Columbia professor leaned forward, visibly shaken. Then came the fourth question, a challenge designed to break him. A theoretical sequence leading to a paradox, designed to throw off even seasoned professionals. The host's tone shifted subtly, laced with anticipation, but Carter remained still. He read it once. His lips barely parted as he worked silently, his fingers twitching by his side. Then, without lifting his gaze, he said, flatly, that the equation was based on a flawed assumption, and explained the error line by line. He didn't just solve it, he corrected the question. The panel fell silent. The room no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a courtroom, and Carter had just delivered a closing argument no one could contest. The timer above the board read 9 minutes and 42 seconds. 4 problems, 4 flawless answers. All live, no notes, no edits. The host struggled to maintain her composure. Her closing lines were rushed, her voice tinged with the shock of a narrative collapsing on air. They had expected a talented child. What they witnessed was mastery that didn't require translation. Brilliance without negotiation. The show faded to commercial, but online it had already begun. Clips circulated before the segment had even ended. Educators on Twitter posted timestamps. Mathematicians broke down each response, confirming again and again. Not only were Carter's answers correct, they were more efficient than the solutions the panel had prepared. And then something unexpected happened. A new name trended. Dr. Daniel Arrington, a senior member of Harvard's mathematics department, posted a single, unscheduled tweet. I was in the room the day they removed Carter. I stayed quiet. I can't anymore. It detonated online. No context. No elaboration. Just those words. But they hit with force. Elise read it backstage. Her breath caught. The tweet was followed by a thread. In it, Dr. Arrington described the internal conversation that had taken place weeks earlier, naming the professors, citing the concerns raised, not about Carter's intellect, but about public optics, overexposure, and classroom friction. He admitted he had disagreed, but stayed silent out of fear of professional backlash. Now watching Carter prove himself on a national stage, he could no longer justify that silence. He ended the thread with a single sentence. He wasn't removed because he couldn't solve the problems. He was removed because he did. The internet exploded. News networks scrambled to confirm the account. Emails leaked earlier were now being connected directly to named faculty. Suddenly, Harvard wasn't just facing public outrage. It was facing internal betrayal. A senior professor had cracked the wall of silence from inside. And Dr. Arrington wasn't alone. Hours later, two more faculty members retweeted his thread, adding their own accounts. One shared an audio file, muffled but clear enough to reveal a closed-door conversation about managing Carter's profile. The other posted a document draft for an internal strategy memo labeled Media Narrative Stabilization, Milton Case. The walls were coming down, and he sat backstage with Elise, sipping from a water bottle, unaware that while the world scrambled to digest the moment, something even bigger had been set in motion. A surprising ally appears from inside Harvard. Harvard's historic brick facade had stood for centuries as a symbol of prestige, its crimson banners fluttering against blue skies like emblems of unshakable authority. But in the days following Carter's televised brilliance and Dr. Arrington's public confession, those bricks began to feel less like a monument and more like a wall cracking from within. The university's silence, once seen as calculated restraint, had become a liability. Public confidence was collapsing. Journalists surrounded campus entrances. Students walked past picket lines, where signs read, "Brilliance has no skin tone," and "You tried to erase him." Professors whispered in lounges, unsure if their emails were being monitored, while administrators shuffled from meeting to meeting with expressions carved from worry. Elise watched from a distance. She didn't need to be close to feel the shift. It was in the air, in the urgency of reporters' calls, in the sudden softness of email requests from Harvard's own PR department, now desperate to open dialogue. Their tone had changed. They were no longer offering explanations. They were begging for cooperation. Then, without ceremony, the university released an official statement. It was posted on their homepage, emailed to alumni, printed on letterhead that bore the university seal, a statement that many had demanded for weeks. The apology, at last. But it didn't read like an apology. The opening paragraph expressed regret for miscommunications and misunderstandings surrounding recent events involving one of our program participants. No names were mentioned. Carter's identity had been reduced to a vague noun, a participant, a shadow. The next line cited unintended impacts, operational oversights, and a commitment to continual growth. It was laced with legalese, carefully scrubbed of liability, devoid of confession. It read like something written not from remorse but from necessity. The final paragraph included a pledge to review current placement and mentorship protocols to ensure a more inclusive academic experience moving forward. Not a single sentence took responsibility. Outside the gates, the protest crowd doubled. What had been a call for justice now became a public trial. Black alumni flooded social media with their own stories of being sidelined, of being called exceptional but unmanageable, of being invited into prestigious halls only to be asked to shrink once they arrived. They shared screenshots, rejection letters, emails coded with terms like tone and cultural adjustment. One alum, a former law student, posted a photograph of herself standing beneath the same Harvard crest 15 years ago, with the caption, "They never expected us to stay loud." And still the university said nothing more. But the outside world did. A nationally televised town hall aired on cable that Friday night. When institutions fail, genius. Elise was invited but declined. She didn't want to sit on another stage. She wanted her son to rest, to breathe. But the conversation moved forward anyway. Policy experts debated structural bias. Advocates dissected the language of Harvard's statement, line by line, exposing the hollow center of its tone. The moderator, a Pulitzer-winning journalist, ended the segment with a direct quote from Carter's televised test. "The equation is built on a flawed assumption." It became the new rallying cry. That same night, Elise received a package. There was no return address, just a small brown envelope, slipped under the hotel door. Inside it, a handwritten letter. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. The message was brief. "I sat in that room when they chose to remove him. I didn't speak then, but I will now." Enclosed is what was removed from the final version of the statement. It was a draft, an earlier version of Harvard's apology. In it, Carter's name had been mentioned. So had the decision-making process. Phrases like institutional misjudgment, systemic blind spots, and racial inequities in academic evaluation were underlined in red ink, with notes in the margins. Too direct, potential risk exposure, and rephrased to soften. Elise stared at the paper. The truth had nearly been spoken, and then buried again. in favor of protecting legacy over honesty. She didn't post the draft. Not yet. But she made a copy. Because this fight was no longer about an apology. It was about accountability. Then came the unexpected twist. A letter arrived at Elise's inbox from the office of the Speaker of the House. Official seal. Government domain. A formal invitation. Carter Milton had been requested to appear before the United States Congress. They wanted him to testify during an upcoming hearing on equity in gifted education and structural bias in elite institutions. Not just as a symbol, as an expert witness, Carter receives an invitation to speak before Congress. The Capitol dome stood against a pale blue sky, polished and sharp like it had been waiting for this moment. Cameras lined the steps, news crews jostled for position. Inside, the echo of polished shoes and hushed voices drifted through marble halls that had held generations of testimony, but none quite like this. Carter Milton sat beside his mother at the edge of the congressional hearing room. The nameplate in front of him was simple. Carter J. Milton, witness. To his right sat Elise, her face composed, but her hands folded tightly in her lap. The room was filled with suits and silence. Rows of lawmakers, aides scribbling notes, and a crowd of journalists waiting for something historic. This was not just a hearing. It was a moment. The committee had convened under the title Equity in Gifted Education, unveiling bias in elite institutions. Carter had been invited not as a victim, but as the spark that ignited national outrage. The boy who had been removed for being too brilliant was now being asked to help rewrite the rules. When the chairwoman, a congresswoman from New York, introduced him, her voice was steady but reverent. She spoke not of the headlines, but of the silence that had once surrounded stories like his. Carter stood slowly. He didn't wear a suit, just a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, the same way he had always preferred to think, unrestricted. He didn't use a script. He spoke from memory. Quietly, without flair, with the precision of someone who had learned that the most powerful truth is the one that doesn't need to shout. He told them about the classroom, about the removal, about the way no one looked him in the eye as they told him to leave. He described the hallway where he sat solving problems in his head, because no one had asked to see what he knew. He spoke of how it felt when the institution that once praised his score erased his presence, the moment he outshined expectations. There were no tears, no dramatic pauses, just clarity. He told the committee that racism in education didn't always wear hoods or scream slurs. It sometimes wore blazers and carried evaluation forms. It showed up in phrases like "not a fit," in policies written to sound neutral but enforced with a quiet cruelty that only brilliance in black skin seemed to provoke. As he spoke, some lawmakers nodded. Others looked down, visibly uncomfortable. A few seemed genuinely shaken. Then Carter said something no one expected. He admitted that he had begun to doubt his own mind after the removal. That even with his mother's love, with the world cheering for him online, there had been moments where he questioned whether his intellect was real, or just tolerated when convenient. He said that for a system to truly harm a gifted black child, it doesn't have to crush them, it just has to convince them that their light is a liability. That sentence didn't just land. It lingered. The room fell still. Reporters scribbled. Cameras zoomed. But Carter didn't shift in his seat. He ended by saying he didn't want anyone else to sit in a hallway, knowing the answer to a question they were never allowed to be asked. When he sat back down, the room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence was louder than applause. Later, Elise would tell reporters that she'd never been prouder. But in the moment she just reached under the table and gently squeezed his hand. He squeezed back once, still calm, still unshaken. The next speaker was an education policy researcher, then a retired principal, but it was clear who the nation had come to hear. Carter's name trended again, this time not as a victim, not as a prodigy, but as a reformer. In the days that followed, education committees launched reviews of advanced placement systems. Parents of gifted black students shared their stories, some nearly identical to Carter's. Ivy League institutions began quietly revising their summer program protocols. Public schools requested new frameworks for identifying gifted children beyond standardized test scores and cultural norms. But none of that compared to what came next. In a press conference 1 week later, Senator Leslie Harrow, a rising political figure with a history of fighting education inequality, stood on the Capitol steps with a bill in her hands. The cameras flashed. Her voice was crisp. She announced the proposal of a new federal initiative aimed at addressing racial inequity in advanced education programs. Its name was simple: The Carter-Milton Educational Equity Act. A senator proposes the Carter-Milton Educational Equity Act. The moment Carter-Milton's testimony aired, something in the American consciousness cracked open. For a brief window of time, it felt as if the nation held its breath, not just for him but for every gifted child who had ever been told to dim their light. Yet as quickly as that moment arrived, the other side of fame revealed itself. The silence of rejection had transformed into a new kind of noise, sharper, louder, and far more calculated. The first signs came subtly. Commentators who had initially praised Carter began offering balanced takes, framing his story as complicated and emotionally compelling, but incomplete. Television panels stacked with pundits questioned whether the final exam had truly been as difficult as claimed. One academic accused Elise of weaponizing her child's intellect for a political narrative. Social media, once a chorus of support, fractured. Troll accounts appeared overnight, some using AI-generated avatars, spreading misinformation about the test, the timeline, and Carter's mental abilities. In private groups, the attacks were worse. Elise received emails from blocked senders, warning her to back off before Harvard sues. Other messages came laced with coded threats disguised as concern. You don't want to ruin his future over a few weeks of attention. For every door Carter had opened in the public eye, 1,000 whispered efforts were being made behind it to close it quietly again. Even other academic institutions, ones not directly involved, began to shift. Invitations to conferences were postponed indefinitely. Think tanks that had once expressed interest in featuring Carter now offered silence, or worse, excuses. One renowned STEM panel rescinded his invitation, citing security concerns. Elise knew what that meant. The institutions aren't questioning Carter's talent, they were terrified of what his presence revealed about their systems. But while others moved with fear, Carter moved with focus. He returned to his routines, reading, solving, creating. He no longer chased validation. Instead, he became a mirror. He read the criticisms not with anger, but with analysis, tracing the equations of power in the very structure of their attacks. He didn't ask why they hated him. He asked what systems made that hatred inevitable. Then came the letters. Dozens at first. Then hundreds. Then thousands. They came from children, teenagers, parents, teachers. Some were scribbled in pencil on lined paper. Others arrived by email, typed carefully by fingers that had never written to anyone before. They told stories of exclusion, of skipped grades that never happened, of gifted programs that were only offered to the right kind of students. One 10-year-old from Detroit wrote, "They always say I'm too excited when I get the right answer. But when other kids shout, it's fine." Carter read every word. He began to respond, not with press statements or sound bites, but with handwritten replies, recordings of himself solving problems sent in by young students, videos explaining concepts that no one had taken the time to explain to them. He knew now that this wasn't just his fight, it never had been. It was a lineage of erasure, one he refused to let continue. Yet the backlash evolved too. A private university Elise had been negotiating with for Carter's dual enrollment suddenly reversed course, saying they had reevaluated their offerings. One Ivy-affiliated institution quietly removed a black faculty member who had publicly praised Carter's televised appearance. A major online publication commissioned a piece titled, "The Myth of the Isolated Genius," thinly veiled as a critique of idolizing child prodigies, but clearly targeted at him. It was clear, Carter had become both a hero and a threat. But from that tension, a movement was growing. A group of black STEM professionals launched an open-access repository of resources for gifted students from underrepresented communities, naming it the Milton Archive. Several public school districts began reevaluating how they defined giftedness, removing rigid barriers like standardized tests that had historically marginalized students of color. Online, black mathematicians, engineers and coders began posting under the hashtag #NIWasCarter2, sharing stories that echoed his like haunting refrains. For every institutional pushback, the grassroots response was louder, more creative, and more enduring. And then came the moment Elise never expected. Her inbox pinged quietly at 3:12 a.m. 3 emails, 3 different subject lines, 3 different institutions. The first was from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The second was from Stanford. The third, from Yale. Each message was brief, direct, and free of conditions. They had seen the footage. They had reviewed Carter's mental solutions, his congressional testimony, and his original placement scores. They weren't offering tours or summer camps. They were offering full academic scholarships, guaranteed placements, immediate access to mentorship, and a commitment to fund any project Carter chose to pursue. No entrance essays. No interviews. No waiting. Just acknowledgement. Not because of a PR campaign. Not because of pity. But because they had no other choice. Carter is offered a full scholarship by MIT, Stanford, and Yale. The corridors of MIT were long and quiet in the early morning, their steel blue walls reflecting a sterile calm, disturbed only by the distant hum of computers and the soft echo of footsteps. It was here, beneath domes that had watched over generations of minds, that Carter Milton, now 16, walked alone, a backpack slung over one shoulder and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He wasn't just a student now. He was history, in motion. Carter had become the youngest student ever admitted to MIT's dual PhD program in mathematics and theoretical systems. The decision had stunned even the institution's senior faculty, but his application hadn't needed decoration. His congressional testimony had been cited in national journals. His mental mastery of Harvard's final exam had been verified by experts on 4 continents. But what truly set him apart was his purpose. He didn't want applause. He wanted access for others. The world had tried to turn him into a spectacle. Hollywood producers called Elise with offers. Major publishing houses competed to buy his story. A documentary film team followed them for 3 months before Carter asked them to stop. He didn't like cameras. He liked chalkboards. Still, the books came. 1 biography, then 2. A best-selling memoir penned by Elise herself. A film adaptation was greenlit by a major studio, though Carter refused to act in it or even attend the premiere. He gave them permission to tell the story, but he was already focused on writing a different one. His classroom at MIT became a place of quiet revolution. Surrounded by post-doctoral researchers, twice his age, Carter brought something that no paper or theory could replicate: a brain untouched by traditional fear. He didn't follow the line. He reimagined the shape of the line entirely. Professors, some skeptical at first, soon found themselves consulting him, asking him how he visualized problems, how he folded logic into memory, how he solved by seeing rather than computing. But the accolades meant little to him without impact. Each week, he Zoomed with young students across the country, children from overlooked school districts, homeschooled teens, with brilliant minds and no mentors. He offered help freely, mentoring them through video calls, building custom lessons on whiteboards that he uploaded online. He didn't teach them just how to solve. He taught them how to see. The Carter method, once a movement sparked by viral outrage, evolved into a full curriculum. Pilot programs launched in Detroit, Oakland, and Atlanta. It was math without fear, rigor without punishment, genius without gatekeeping. But Carter wanted more. He began writing proposals for a standalone institution, a math academy unlike anything in the country. Not for the privileged, not for the polished, but for the unseen, for the black kids who weren't given enrichment, only discipline, for the gifted children who were suspended for talking too much, or labeled defiant for correcting a teacher's mistake. He designed every detail.
There would be no grades. Only mastery.
No entrance exams. Only curiosity. No uniforms. Only questions. He submitted the blueprint to private funders, and within months, support poured in. Civil rights organizations pledged funding. Celebrities offered land. A quiet billionaire offered to cover the first 5 years of operation. No one asked him to water it down. They trusted him because they had seen what happened when the world tried to silence him. Construction began the following spring in Atlanta. He named it not after himself, but after the hallway where it all started. The third floor academy, a nod to the silent space where he was removed, where he solved in solitude, and where the system thought he'd quietly disappear. Now he would fill that void with voices. He walked through the empty construction site one evening. Hard hat on, floors still unfinished. He ran his hand along the raw frame of a classroom wall, imagining the laughter, the equations, the questions that would soon fill the space. Elise stood beside him. She had aged, but with pride in her bones. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her son was no longer just the child they tried to remove. He was the architect of a future they never saw coming. And as he turned to leave the site that night, the city skyline behind him glowing in quiet respect, a small sign was hammered into the grass near the entrance. It was temporary, handwritten, but powerful. It read, "Opening soon for every genius they tried to erase." Carter opens his own math academy for gifted black students. If you've ever been told you don't belong, if you've ever watched genius get silenced just because of who it came from, then you already know this story isn't just about Carter. It's about all of us, and what we choose to do when the system gets caught lying. Type yes if you believe brilliance should never be buried. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.